Hello everyone, my name is Reigh Dimailig, and this is my submission for the ENCMP project. I ended up making a Tetris-like game, and honestly, it was a pretty wild ride. I'm gonna walk you through how I built it, the different versions I worked on, and some of the stuff I learned along the way. Without further ado, let's get to version 1. Version 1 was just figuring out what the plot was going to look like. Putting on the grids, figuring out what the shape of the block, the colors, plotting them, and getting rid of the axis labels. This was far by the second hardest thing I did in this project. I know how to plot simple graphs, like bar graphs, but I really didn't know how to edit the graph to look like the way I wanted it to look like. I also have a little idea on how I want my blocks to look like, but at the same time, it's quite hard to get started when I don't know how to code them. Later, I found out on eClass there are example codes, and one of them is a file dedicated on graphics, creating shapes, coloring them, and editing graphs. It was overwhelming because this was all new. We had never really covered this topic before in our lectures, so I had to rely on Google a lot, as well as the Matplotlib library, which was very useful. The compiled images that you see in here are the result of the different versions of the code that I tested. Some of them have weird shapes, and some of the blocks don't have outlines, which I eventually fixed by using the edge color function. You can also see in here where I tried to add grid lines by manually typing each one line. I couldn't really figure out how to do the PLT grid function to make them visible in this setup, so I ended up plotting them one by one, which later I found out that I could just use a for loop and in range to make my life way easier. Next is version 2. Version 2 was definitely the hardest out of all three of them. I have over 40 untitled code files dedicated to this project, and it's the reason why I cannot show you a clear and complete version of what the code looks like for version 2. And on this slide, I just copy and pasted a part of each code that I developed along the way when creating version 2. One thing that I added or changed was how I was drawing the blocks. I stored them in a dictionary, and each coordinate you see in here is associated with a square of the block. So instead of creating the entire block as one entity, I plotted each 4 squares that make up the block individually and then combined them to form that shape. Each block was linked into different keys to match them with their color. Every XY coordinates defines the block structures. Then came rotation, which I considered one of my regrets because I couldn't really figure it out how to correctly do it. In this version, I rotated blocks 90 degrees clockwise around their origin. But by origin, I mean the tip or the edge of the block, not the centroid like what I originally wanted. Rotating around the centroid would have kept the block aligned, so they wouldn't accidentally shift left, right, or even up. I was able to figure out how to rotate them in their centroids. But this causes new problems though. The blocks would cross the grid lines, which isn't supposed to happen. They would stack up weirdly, and as you can see in this issue, they would overlap sometimes, and it's just a total mess. I did consider a few solutions. One of them was just brute forcing them, like plotting each possible block rotation combination that could happen. Another was adding a small adjustment to nudge the blocks back into the place when they cross the grid lines. But even that didn't solve the stacking problems. So in the end, I settled for rotating the blocks 90 degrees using one of their edges squared as a pivot point. Because of this, when you play the game and rotate the block, you might notice a shift left, right, or even down slightly, but it works for now. I definitely plan to revisit this and improve this later. Another major changes in version 2 that I made was using keyboard for controls instead of having the player to type the moves directly into the console and hitting enter, which takes up time. At first, I thought about using the influence function, but I quickly realized that this isn't really efficient. The player would have to type the move and hit enter every time, which pauses the game, and that's not what I wanted. The block should move continuously without interruption. This was where I got really stuck, because I needed a way for the game to recognize the key presses instantly and execute the command without needing the user to hit enter. So after some research online, I found out about the Matplotlib's MPL_connect function, which lets the plot respond to the key presses. It took me a long time to figure it out, but eventually I got working. This lets you interact with the plot window, so it listens for action like key presses or mouse clicks and runs specific code in response to that action. For example, if you press a key, the game immediately recognizes it and moves the block without pausing. Lastly, for version 2, was I changed the background color to black because it just looks way cooler that way. I used the face color function for this part, which I found in the Matplotlib library and in the example code that we did on some of the lectures. And that's it for version 2. Next is version 3, which is the final version, and altogether, it's just wrapping up the code. By the final version, I sorted out the keyboard issue by running the game in an external terminal, because in the regular Python Spider console, it doesn't really accept keyboard inputs, so you have to put it in an external terminal so that you can move the blocks left or right and down. Overall, the final version was all about polishing the user's experience. I added a high score tracker that saves until you close the window, so if you don't close the game, you can still keep track of your high score. And I also made it so that if you want to try the game again, all you have to do is press the spacebar button on your keyboard. I still wasn't able to fix the rotation completely though, but it's something that I will for sure revisit later. But for now, the game works, so it's fine. Here's the final game. Press the spacebar and move.